Hello, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today's lesson is on Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley, two really fascinating women writers from the American colonial period. And today we'll be working on skills of literary study, as we always do. Particularly hoping to give you some practice at reading and responding to poetry, being an active and attentive, close reader, paying attention to the speaker, who the audience is, what the rhetorical situation is, what the speaker is trying to persuade or achieve with her audience, the use of figurative language, how there are shifts in the intellectual or emotional perspective, and especially how the poem's exploration of its topic develops throughout the course of the poem. We want to think about these texts in their historical moment. Why did Bradstreet in the 1600s and Phyllis Wheatley in 1770s Boston, why did they have to make the kinds of arguments that they did in those moments? And then we also want to think about, from our own historical perspective, why are these poems still interesting to us? And for my money, I think what's most interesting about these writers is the ways in which they're negotiating these very complex social positions that they are in. I mean, how, after all, does one write in a culture that denies you full personhood and does not deem your experience to be a worthy topic for poetry? So both of these writers appeal to and lay claim to the dominant ideals of their communities, often religious ideas, right? And for Wheatley, liberal ideas about liberty from that revolutionary period of the 1770s. And they also push back against certain assumptions of that dominant culture in order to assert their authority as writers and to assert the validity of their experience. So here we go. We'll start with Bradstreet's The Author to Her Book. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet, being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou run'st more hobbling than is meet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array, 'mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where thou art yet not known. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother she, alas, is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. Now, the immediate context for this poem, Bradstreet's collection of poems was published in 1650 at the advice and urging and through the help of her brother-in-law. And this poem appears to have been written as a preface to a second edition of her poems, which didn't happen till after she died. As readers, what we really have to come to terms with here is that this poem is one long extended metaphor, that the poet's relation to her book is the mother's relation to its child. So we need to work through a metaphor on the literal level. So what kind of mother is this and what kind of child is this? And then figure out the figurative meanings of the metaphor. What does it say about her as an author and this as a book of poems? And really the question is, what's the motive for using this metaphor? What does she gain? What are the benefits for Anne Bradstreet to talk about her relation to her book as being a mother's relation to its child? So first of all, notice that there's a lot of humor here, right? That the child is described as ill-formed. That when it comes back to her, she's embarrassed and blushed to see this child call her mother. That the visage was irksome. The child's face is ugly, right? that it runs hobbling and in rags. Now, these jokes would be disturbing if we were talking about a real child, but of course this is all tongue-in-cheek. The reader knows this is a metaphor, so the humor here is really self-deprecating, right? It's Bradstreet at her own expense making fun of herself as a bad mother or a bad poet with an ugly child or a bad book of poems, right? But it's interesting to ask, why does she want to use that kind of self-deprecating humor as a woman being published in kind of extraordinary circumstances in the 17th century? It also casts Bradstreet in a very typical, traditional female role. So at the same time as she's putting herself in an exceptional role as an author, as a writer, she's presenting herself as just a mother, right? I'm just a poor mother. So the poem lies by her side like a baby, right? And she washes its face and she wishes it had better clothes, and she's just a poor mother. So there is also a certain protection here, I think, for Bradstreet to present herself as a female, motherly type of a creator. And there are a number of jokes here as well about the publication process. So when she says that friends took the baby from her side, that's a reference to the fact that it was her brother-in-law and others who convinced her to publish her first book of poems. The errors that were introduced in the printing process in setting the printing type. Rags is a joke on the fact that rags were used to create paper in publishing back in those days. In lines 15 and 16, there's a reference to the mother's attempt to stretch out the joints of the child, which sounds painful, really, right? And kind of torturous, and would be terrible if we're talking about an actual child here. But that's a joke on metric feet. In poetic meter, the foot is a metric unit in a poetic line. So in iambic pentameter, the metric foot is the iamb, and there are 5 iambs per line. So she's making a joke there that the meter, the rhythm, the music of her poems, her child, limped along, and she tried to stretch them out and make it smooth and more graceful, but it's still hobbling. And the homespun cloth may be a reference to the cover of a book, but it's also these metaphors. Homespun cloth is also something that a woman on the frontier makes in her own house. So Bradstreet is also giving us a reference here to the fact that she's reminding readers that she's not a noblewoman who wrote these poems in England in a life of leisure. She's a mother on the frontier who wrote her poetry amidst the other domestic duties that she had as a Puritan wife. Again, there's more jokes. This last one, around line 23 or so. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none. That's almost a joke on the child being illegitimate, a bastard, right? Or at least an orphan, right? But there's also a kind of a subversive pride there, right? If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none. In other words, there's no man behind this poetry. I'm the author. This is a motherly, a maternal, a female creation. Although then you hear the humility too, right? And for thy mother, she, alas, is poor. Well, why does Bradstreet want to have this humor that's so self-deprecating? Well, she says in lines 19 and 20, in this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam. Common people can read you. That's what vulgar means, common. But don't let the critics get a hold of you. So you get a sense that Bradstreet here is trying to fend off or stave off criticism that she might get and present herself in a humble view. I'm just a poor mom. This is my poor ugly baby, right? Now, the last thing I would say is, behind this stance of humility and self-deprecation, there's the question of the quality of her poetic performance here, including the skill with which she uses this metaphor and humor to make fun of herself. And so it's a very skillful poem, which of course really belies or in some way undermines the humility that she's voicing here, right? So I guess the point here is that this is a very complicated dance that Bradstreet feels she has to do to combine a kind of in a socially acceptable way the roles and the values of being a traditional woman with being a mother. Okay, now we will move on to Phyllis Wheatley. This is the most famous poem she ever wrote, a short little 8-line poem, but man, there's a lot going on in these 8 lines. This one is called On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is the diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Okay, well, the argument of this poem, I think the thing that strikes us right off the bat is this opening claim that it was merciful that Bradstreet or that Wheatley got sold into slavery and brought to America as a slave, and that's a claim that seems so strange. How could somebody argue that? Well, it's a religious argument, and we're getting that argument in the first half of the poem and the first 4 lines of the poem. The argument is once I redemption neither sought nor knew. So if I hadn't been brought from Africa, Wheatley, who was raised as a Christian, so he's writing this as a Christian, if I had stayed in Africa, I wouldn't have been brought to Christianity. I wouldn't have been brought to my salvation. Now, from our modern sensibility, that seems like kind of a tough political argument to swallow. But let's think about why this would be a powerful move on Wheatley's part, right? That she can present herself as a Christian, writing to her readers as Christians, right? And remember, Wheatley here is really in even a far more complicated position than Bradstreet, because Wheatley's not just a woman, but she's an African, she's black, and she's a slave. So there are 3 different ways in which the society doesn't view her as a full person, right? And you remember, we've read Thomas Jefferson, what he says about Phyllis Wheatley, how dismissive he is of her, and he uses her poetry as an example of the fact that Africans aren't fully human. They're not really capable of high art or poetry. So this is what Phyllis Wheatley is up against, right? So we get this religious argument in the first half of the poem, and some of the key terms that jump out here are pagan and benighted, right? And I think they highlight some of the difficulties of the kind of religious discourse that she's using, and some of its negative baggage, right? So pagan literally just means polytheistic, not monotheistic, worshiping, numerous gods or false idols. But probably in this context, it primarily means not Christian, right? But of course, it's got a lot of baggage to it. The whole history in Western culture of saying that, non-Western peoples, people of color from different other regions of the globe are somehow pagan, heathen, not as spiritual or moral as white Western Europeans. And that word benighted literally means ignorant, right? Kept in ignorance, but it also means in the dark, right? In darkness. So Wheatley here is using this kind of language from Western religion: black, white, light, darkness, good, evil. That was unfortunately, used to perpetuate racism and applied in a racist fashion. So as she's making this argument, about how she's so much better to have been brought to America, she's playing with ideas here that have been used partly to justify slavery, right? Oh, slaves are better off because, they were heathens and savages over in Africa, and we brought them to, their kind masters have brought them to Christianity here, right? And the second half of the poem, so if Wheatley is getting herself into some of these complexities by using these religious arguments, religion is also a really powerful tool for her. And when we read Harriet Beecher Stowe and when we read Frederick Douglass, religion is a powerful argument in the anti-slavery debate, in the anti-slavery cause, because there is an assertion of human equality. If you present yourself as a Christian, as an immortal soul. You're presenting yourself as an equal being in God's eyes, and that's exactly where Wheatley goes, right, in the second half of the poem. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. So there she's calling out exactly that issue of this imagery of blackness and whiteness that's kind of uncomfortably there in the first part of the poem. And notice how she's positioning herself in relation to the readers. She says, some say this. She doesn't say you, reader, necessarily, right? And then she gives voice to these kinds of racist ideas. So the white reader who maybe is reading this poem, is that quoted line kind of telling them something they've said to themselves, some racist thought that they've had or that they've heard other white people say. But you can see that Wheatley's pushing that argument with them. And then in the final two lines, which are the real conclusion of the poem, she takes it directly to the reader. Remember, Christians, right? Now she's addressing them as Christians, right? From one Christian to another. And that remember, that's a command, right? That's the imperative mode or the imperative mood in grammar. She's telling them to remember their Christian duty, right? And to do their good Christian duty. Now the tone is very humble, right? When we get to Frederick Douglass, we'll hear an African-American writer who challenges the hypocrisy of American Christians about the issue of slavery in a much more angry way and direct way. Well, Wheatley doesn't feel like she can take that kind of tone here. She's not using that kind of strategy here, but she is addressing her readers directly here, right? And what is she saying about them? Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Well, that reference to Cain and that God put a mark on Cain after he killed his brother Abel, that's another one of those tricky biblical references where that people who were apologists for slavery would say, see, there in the Bible, blackness is associated with evil. So she's citing that, right? But her larger point is one of equality, right? That we all can be refined, right? So the mark on Cain isn't just something against Africans, right? It's about human sinfulness, human fallenness, and we all can be refined and all be equal in God's eyes, right? So as is the case with Bradstreet, I think this is a really remarkable performance on Wheatley's part. She's playing with that language and imagery from the Western tradition, those images of blackness and whiteness that had been used to perpetuate racism, but she's taking ownership here over a Christian argument and applying it in an argument against racism. It's not an anti-slavery poem exactly, but this kind of religious appeal clearly is a critique of slavery or has a strong critique of slavery in it. So as with Bradstreet, Wheatley here is dancing a very complicated dance, right? She's writing to the readers of her day, trying to find that common vocabulary she has with them, the shared ideas that she has with them from one Christian to another, and to use those shared ideas to help her assert her own voice and her own humanity. So, I hope that this will give you a good start and that you'll be able to apply this kind of close reading and careful attention in your own reading of the rest of the poems by Bradstreet and Wheatley that we're going to be studying together. And I hope that you'll be able to see some similar kinds of issues or strategies coming up in their other poems. So happy reading, and I look forward to discussing these ideas with you online. Thanks.